I've been asked to talk about data science and how it might impact upon how we work as a community, but more importantly, people's lives. And I'm going to try to convince you that we're at an inflection point where we're seeing a fusion of biology with physical sciences and computational sciences, and that if we systematically embrace this, then it will have huge, huge potential. But we also need to manage the risks. And I would argue that this data-enabled community, that's you, has a great opportunity to harness this and demonstrate leadership. So that's what I'm going to try and do. And I'd like to thank Eric, Kirkpatrick, and Ian Young for inviting me to contribute today. So for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about, can we gear up entire countries for quality healthcare, which is what we all want to see, but also research and innovation, because what we need to see is a convergence of care with research. I'm going to argue that data science is a catalyst for change. Now, definitions are important. So my definition of data science is the interface between mathematics, statistics, computational science, and domain. And our domain is healthcare and biochemical medicine. So how many mathematicians in the room? One. I could say you're an outlier. How many statisticians? Right, okay, one or two. A lady in the corner. How about computational scientists? Any None. Right. And what about domain? Well, everyone's in their domain. So I would argue that in 5 years' time, we've got to look at the mix, because if we bring math, stats, and computational science into medicine, we'll be making great strides. And lastly, I want to talk about trust. With big data goes big responsibilities, and that we will need a new social contract if we're going to harness data science in a reliable and trustworthy way. But before we do that, a slide from the UK, because last year we celebrated the 70th birthday of the National Health Service. It's outlasted 14 prime ministers. It's been a reliable national institution. Some people say 15 prime ministers very soon. And this was the guy who invented it. His name was Nye Bevan, and he launched it in Manchester, and he said it's quite the most ambitious adventure in the care of national health that any country has ever seen. And it has. It's been very enduring. Some people suggest this is Mrs. Thatcher in the bed listening to him. So that was 1947. No, 48, sorry. Now, in the same year, something very important, but on a much smaller scale, was happening in this place. Do you know where this is? Do you know where that? There's a clue. You see that clue? Yeah. So this is Framingham. So it was Framingham. It's a little town. It's about 40 miles due west of Boston in Massachusetts. And it was in 1948, I would argue, it was the first time that citizens got together with scientists and healthcare professionals to do something very special. So what did they do? There's only 5,000 people, but they subscribed to regular health checks. And there are now 3 or 4 generations, here they are, and it's truly iconic. It's over 2,000 contributions to the international literature. And what did Framingham tell us? It coined the phrase risk factors. It's your world. When we measure variables, how are they linked to outcomes, whether that's smoking, cholesterol, blood glucose, and how they link to heart attacks and stroke. And Claude Lafont, in his Shattuck lecture a few years ago, he preceded Francis Collins, suggested Framingham, 5,000 people, has resulted in an average of 4 extra years of life. Isn't that remarkable? From 5,000 people. And indeed, any general practitioners here? One or two? If you're in your clinic and you're calculating the primary cardiovascular risk of someone without heart disease, those quadratic equations are derived from Framingham data. So it's quite a remarkable thought. 5,000 people changing global health practice. And if you log on to the Framingham Civic website, they, with classical American modesty, suggest that we are the town that changed America's heart. So how can we use data to translate excellence in life sciences through translation and innovation to world-class patient care? And that's the theme of my talk today. And data science is a catalyst for change. And I'm going to argue that this is about detail and scale. We need to think about doing this not only at the national level, but also internationally through collaboration, detail, and scale. And a little case study I want to show you is how we've been trying to embrace this philosophy for many years in Scotland, which is a wee country north of here, where we've tried to embrace data as a catalyst for change. So you'll recognize this as the new official map of Scotland. We have a population of about 5 million. It's tractable, but Scotland's not big enough, and that's what I'm going to argue later. But what we've managed to do, and it's delightful that Nick Mills is here in the front row. You're hearing from him later because he's really a major driver of this. We have 38 hospitals. We've got 5 million people. We spend about 15 billion euros on health. But what we've tried to do is collaborate at scale, collaborate at the interface, compete at the implementation using data. Now, your countries will be the same as ours. We're very good at measuring process. What sort of activity do health services do? In terms of GP contacts, in terms of A&E attendances, in terms of discharges from hospitals. So health systems are absolutely terrific at measuring process. But actually, if we're really going to make progress, we need to migrate from activity to real-time measurement of processes and outcomes meaningful for patients. And that's called phenotyping. How do we phenotype in real time to improve care, but to research? And we were able to do that in Scotland because for many years we stole it from the Scandinavians. We've used a unique patient identifier for all episodes of healthcare. So this is my number. And it's highly effective. So as you can see, I'm 54 years old. I should say there are not 5 genders in Scotland. And then there's a checksum to ensure that the number is valid. And what that allows you to do is join up journeys of care. Because our poor patients often bounce between bits of the system, the hospital, to the laboratory, to the screening, to the nurse. But what we've tried to do is link the data in real time to drive journeys of care. So 3 quick examples. Libby Morris, she was a GP. She led this for the nation. It's very simple. It's an emergency care summary. So if you're admitted to any of those 38 hospitals in Scotland, you can pull up the primary care record with consent. We use it 3.5 million times a year, and it changes practice in 20%. Radiology. Any radiologists in the room? Right, okay. We have a nationwide PACS system, 1.2 petabytes of data, 24,000 users across the country. We access it 9,000 times a day. It stops duplication of care. So if you had an X-ray here, you can see it. Importantly, it creates an image database for 31 million studies for care and research, about 1.2 petabytes. And this is one of the things Nick is leading on. My own world, I'm a diabetes guy. This is where I met Eric. So for the last 20 years, we've had a single whole system intelligence for every person living with diabetes in Scotland in real time. 38 hospitals, 1,000 practices, and it's given us a longitudinal picture of care, linking in to the laboratories, the eye screening, the pharmacies, the hospitals, the GP practices. And for the last 15 years, what we showed was that process-wise, we've been capturing data on over 95% of people living with diabetes in Scotland, which is pretty good. And actually, in the early days, so these days for about 10 years old, but we showed pretty early impact on outcomes, whether it's amputation, sight-threatening eye disease, or stroke. And that has been sustained. In fact, life expectancy is improving. This is not rocket science, this is whole system intelligence using data so folk don't fall through the gaps. But then you can use that same mechanism for national level studies. So how can we, in a trustworthy way, curate data from across the journey of care, even link it with social environmental data sets to derive new knowledge, which we can then flip back into care pathways. And I call that the learning health system. The learning health system. Collect data once and use it often, whether it's for disease prevention, earlier diagnosis, better way of driving efficiency in our NHS systems, or even precision medicine. So 3 early examples which were using the data in a pretty static way to derive new knowledge. So this is Jill Pell, a friend from Glasgow. Remember the smoking ban? Great policy. So Jill asked, did it work? So using a non-experimental evaluation, she looked at coronary vascular admissions pre and post-ban, and she showed that admissions fell by 17%, but interestingly, 67% of the reductions post-ban was in non-smokers, illustrating the disbenefits of passive smoking. And indeed, even in acute asthma. So she looked at hospitalization for children aged 5 for acute asthma before and after the ban, and in the New England Journal, she showed that before the ban there was a 5% increase per annum, after the ban 18% decrease. So using data for evidence of policy. This is Dave Newby, a friend of Nick's. This is used the same data for trials. So a question as we look at new technologies, do they work? So CT, coronary angiography, for the assessment of acute chest pain. So how do we assess whether it's actually better than usual care, which is admission, troponin, exercise test, and potential future coronary angiography? So using Scotland as a single research site, what the team did was randomize almost 50% of all eligible people to either routine care or the new intervention. But the key to this was twofold. Firstly, because of the nationwide network, we could harmonize across 12 sites. But most importantly, we could use data to follow up patients routinely. So we didn't need a squadron of research nurses to actually do. And actually, when I was chief scientist in Scotland, we funded this study, which was published, Dave and colleagues published it not only in The Lancet, 2 years follow-up in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing the beneficial impact of this new technology. Really important to me as a funder was it cost £600,000, which is a lot of, it's about 700,000 euros. But at the same meeting in the States, I'm told that a similar American study cost $37 million. So how you use data to actually enable clinical trials at scale. And it changed the diagnosis 1 in 4, changed the management 1 in 4. Similarly with prescribing, you know, we spend 14% of our budget on drugs, but we have little evidence of how safe they are, how effective they are post-launch. So nationwide pharmacoepidemiology is a potential application. Aziz Sheikh. Again, this is using data in the traditional academic way and publishing based on historical data. But it's very, very powerful. So that's where we are. Where are we going to? The 4th industrial revolution. So this is here. Eric Kirkpatrick remembers the first, which was actually the mechanical loom. But as you know, we've gone beyond the 3rd, which I call the pull generation. So that's when I use Google, I pull information to me, to how we use data and analytics in real time. And this is here. This is Davos. The World Economic Forum talks about the 4th industrial revolution because it's immensely disruptive. Disrupting every industry in every nation. The rate of change is exponential rather than linear, and actually it has its downsides, its disbenefits. It's undermining the fabric of democracy, and actually, certainly in the UK, it's seeing the death of the high street because everyone's shopping on Amazon, so folk are losing their jobs. So the challenge for us is how do we harness the 4th industrial revolution in a trustworthy way? Because it's coming. We cannot ignore it. It is coming. So if we look at AI today across, this is Aradazi's stuff from Doha, actually. If we look at our sector, are we leading in data science and AI? No, we're not. We're sort of mid-table. You know, we're not a Barcelona or a Real Madrid. We're mid-table. As expected, financial services and high-tech companies are out in front of us. So there is a gap between what's possible and what we're doing. But it's important. So again, let's flip back to the health system. So this is a slide from Baker, published a few years ago, because he looked internationally, he said, if you look at those really highly performing health systems, what are the common characteristics? So it's a bit busy. He listed 12, usual stuff we'd expect: quality, leadership, and system governance. But two things I would highlight: those highest performing health systems have whole system intelligence and comprehensive information infrastructures, often in real time. They also invest in data science, innovation, and research to support economic growth. So I think these two characteristics will become increasingly important for us as we look forward. Sorry. Thank you. It's gin, actually. Thank you. That's even better. So why is that important? Because medicine's changing. As you know, many of you will be in diagnostic labs. I quite like Leroy Hood's suggestion that medicine is becoming 4P: predictive, preemptive, personalized, participatory, enabled by new tools. Genomics, or omics, phenotyping, informatics, analytics, and this new social contract. So 4P medicine is coming. That's why it's important. Another reason it's important is scale. We can't do this ourselves. So I want to take you back to Framingham. This was the relationship between blood pressure and mortality in 5,000 people. So you sort of get a sense of a relationship there. 5,000 people, 50,000 people, UK Biobank. So scale is going to be important. And it's important for people living with disease, because as we understand the molecular characteristics of disease, we're seeing that diseases we thought were common are actually clusters of rare disease. For example, when I qualified, there were 5 types of breast cancer defined by H&E staining. This is 1987, and nodal structure. We now know there are 132 causative mutations of breast cancer. And let's think about it. If we wanted to do a study, this is a bit of a thought experiment that Piers Mahon gave me. So how many millions of people in the denominator population would we need if we were to recruit 250 incident cases a year for a clinical trial of a new precision medicine with a cancer and biomarker of various frequencies? So lung cancer, which is a common cancer, to get 250 million at a 1% frequency, which is not atypical, 47 million people. As we go across the rarer cancers, we come to primary hepatic cancer, 447 million people. So we're going to have to collaborate. You know, we can't do this in Edinburgh. We can't do this in London. We've got to think about how we do this at scale. So a few examples of how this is hitting medicine. So this is one of the first sort of landmark studies which looked deep convolutional neural networks, which is sophisticated maths. It's really, it's producing mathematical processes which mimic the biological neuronal networks, by Sebastian Thrun. He was the head of R&D at Google, and he actually won the first DARPA challenge to drive the autonomous vehicle across the Arizona desert. But he's now working in healthcare. He looked at 130,000 skin images. He managed to outperform certified grade dermatologists by getting this machine to say, is this a malignant melanoma? Is this a seborrheic keratosis, a benign nevus? He now wants to put this on a mobile phone so we can self-diagnose. John Dinesh, an HDR UK colleague, looked at the Somologic chip and linked it in blood donors with 3,300 blood donors to discover new biology. He only personally performed 36 billion statistical tests. But what that allows you to do is discover new biology. Almost 2,000 new ways that genes are expressed in plasma, combining these new technologies. What about imaging? So this stuff was published in Cell earlier this year, OCT scans of the eye, chest x-rays, and again, teaching machines to become diagnostic and outperforming, PPV of 95% is pretty good. And it's accurate, and it's able to distinguish bacterial and viral pneumonia. Who would you want to look at your x-ray in the middle of the night? A radiologist who's very tired, or a machine that's done it millions and millions of times? It's not here now, but it will come. And it's also important in the UK, there are 250,000 people waiting today for the results of a radiological examination. So there's lots of delay in the system, as illustrated here. Health screening not meeting targets because of bottlenecks in the system. We were one of the first groups to link electronic health records with GWAS response. So this is using genetic consented data with electronic health record data. And in my world of diabetes, we discovered that metformin, very commonly used drug, was associated with a cancer cell cycle gene. And this finding has actually led to 260 clinical trials internationally looking at the effect of metformin in cancer from a new hypothesis derived from electronic health records. What about supercomputing? It's important. So the Gordon Bell Prize is awarded every year in Arizona. So it was awarded really because of the scale of the analysis, 750,000 genome-wide chips, 1 billion medical records. But basically, we're now computing at the exascale. The exascale. That's almost 2.4 billion comparisons per second. And this capability is there. It's frightening. There's a gentleman on the front row laughing. It is. It's scary, isn't it? It's scary. Traditionally, 5 years ago, this would have taken 15 years to compete. So supercomputing is here. And I would argue that it is coming. So this is a busy slide, but it shows in January of this year, there were 14 FDA approvals or clearances of AI intelligence products. There are now 26, 3 months later. Now, there aren't many drugs here. So what we're seeing is an exponential increase in the way that AI is actually being approved for use in healthcare. However, there are 5 big issues, okay, if we're really going to do this well. And I must commend your community, because I think in the early days when we did diabetes with Eric and others, I was very impressed about how your community embraced standards, because I would argue that's where we have failed our patients. And an example of this is Flatiron. This is a bit of a case study. Data quality and phenotyping is far more challenging than genotyping, okay? And I'm going to illustrate that now. So Flatiron was an SME in the States. It was sold to Roche last year for $2.1 billion, so it was a success. What it did was curate 2.1 million patient records from 210 oncology practices in the States. And basically, it produced research-grade longitudinal multimodal phenotype. So this journey of care, looking at radiology, lab data, genetic data in a very systematic way. And Roche bought it for $2.1 billion because they thought it would be good for clinical trials in silico, okay? And everyone thought this was a great success story. Everyone thought this was AI in action. But it was a mechanical Turk. Does anyone know what a mechanical Turk is? So in the 18th century, there was this big wooden box that played chess. And it actually traveled the world, and it beat Napoleon, and it beat Benjamin Franklin at chess. Everyone thought this was a computer. And, you know, an absolutely incredible invention. Actually, there was a man inside pulling levers. And that's how. But this was curated by hand, largely. Curated by hand. And that's because our phenotyping is so poor. And just to show, how challenged we are, we did publish on metformin, but in the early days, Ewan phoned me up. He says, Andrew, I'll send you the top 20 ways we prescribe metformin in Scotland. And I said, that's very interesting. And he said, these are the bottom 20 ways we prescribe metformin. Some of it is just spelling mistakes. Take 1 Twix a daily, 1 tablet 5 times, it's just rubbish. For metformin alone, 5,700 ways. How can we have precision medicine if we don't have precision prescribing? So also, just to illustrate it slightly tongue-in-cheek, when we were doing diabetes in Scotland, we took the mechanical Turk approach, and these are great colleagues, Janice and Richie. They went around every practice. They looked at 20,000 sets of notes to get that phenotype. And actually, one day, Richie phoned me up. He says, Andrew, we've got a few miracles in Scotland. And I said, what's that? He says, I found 10 patients walking around the streets of Edinburgh who, according to the NHS, are dead. And he said, what should we do? And being an academic, I said, well, we need to publish that, Richie. So we published the life after death range of 1 to 4 years and the resurrection rate. But this is important. And I do look at the medical profession. We have a much greater responsibility to be precise in how we record phenotype. But to do that, we need mature systems. And a lot of this conference, because I've scanned the program, will talk about personalized medicine and prescriptive analytics. Now, if we want that to be routine day in, day, throughout Europe, throughout South America, throughout Africa, then ideally we would have systems that actually promote personalized medicine and prescriptive analytics. So this is a crude American scale, 0 to 8. And if you look at the UK and other European countries, the UK is actually not doing very well. We're down at 2.3. France is better, the US is better, Europe and the whole is. So this digital maturity of health systems is going to be a big thing. And how do we get intelligent systems that promote that whole system intelligence? So phenotyping, digital maturity of health systems. The third thing is that this is a very complex environment. And this is where other industries do far better than us in terms of standardization. So when we mapped the UK, of all those initiatives, institutions, projects which are interested in phenotyping at scale, there's a huge number of them. And what we need to move towards is interoperability, the ability to work across systems with no additional effort. And that is absolutely vital, and that's about standards. I can phone home from China because phones use the GSM standard. You can choose any handset, but you agree on the standards. So this is arguably our biggest challenge. So that was pretty depressing, but I was in Holland recently, and they look exactly the same. And I think your country will be the same. So this issue of interoperability, systematically say, how are we going to communicate with each other when we need to in a reliable, durable way, is absolutely vital. And this will need team science at scale. Team science. So I was trying to find a picture for team science, but this one doesn't really illustrate it. I love the Japanese Prime Minister. So the fourth big issue is this is a tidal wave of data. And I spoke before about heroic individuals, fiefdoms, and silos. Everyone seems to want their computer under their desk and their data under their desk. Those days are gone. Those days are gone. And it's moved really rapidly. So Eric and I graduated in 1987. And this is a picture of state-of-the-art computing in 1987. That was it. That was a big one as well. Did you remember those? Yeah. So where are we now? We've gone through gigas, we've gone through teras, we've gone through petas, we've gone through exas. What comes after exas, do you know? Zetas. We're in a zeta world. The World Wide Web holds 5 zettabytes of data. And other industries have done this. You know, this is Peter Higgs, he's an Edinburgh guy, 30 petabytes per year at CERN. So this is the Higgs boson, this is in Switzerland. When this gets going, this square kilometer array will be the largest telescope on the planet. It will accrue 10 petabytes of data an hour. So, and what we're seeing in industry is a big move towards cloud and hybrid cloud, secure cloud, sovereign cloud. And we have to, you know, this is not going to, we won't be able just to stick with our 286 computer under the desk. We've got to think about infrastructure as a service. The last biggest issue is trust, and we spent a lot of time on this, working with the publics, citizens, juries. We have a public advisory board which advises on everything we do. Because in other sectors, they're letting us down, actually. You know, how do we use data in a trustworthy way? And we need to use personal data for the common good. And especially, I'll touch upon this later, the tech giants need to take lessons from the Human Genome Project and be data stewards, not data owners. What we're seeing is big technology companies trying to buy data, which isn't right. It needs to be non-preferential, non-rivalrous use. And then, yes, one needs to derive intellectual property, but it has to be higher up the stack. We shouldn't have companies just buying whole sections of people's data, in my view. So this is the future, I think. It's about learning health systems, and I would argue that we should do this. You know, when we don't know what the best treatment is, let's assemble the data, analyze, interpret results, but then use data to flip it back into the system, the so-called afferent and efferent loops. So this is Victor Zhao and Chuck Freeman who are advocates of this. And this is where the convergence of care and research comes, because that is a learning system. That will improve productivity, efficiency, but quality of care. But we as academics tend to do this. You know, we get off the bus when we publish it in a journal, and it sits there for years. So how can we deliver the efferent loop using data and analytics? So in the last 5 minutes or so, just want to touch upon, because that's what we're trying to do at the national scale in the UK. And we've set up something called Health Data Research UK, which is a new type of institute, because our vision is that in the future, every health and care interaction and research endeavor will be enhanced by knowledge derived from large-scale data and advanced analytics in real time. You know, I flew here last night on a Vueling plane. It was on time, unlike British Airways. But I know that on that plane, there are 25 sensors on every engine. And they, if it's a Rolls-Royce engine, they send data in real time back to a console in Derby and Singapore, and engine health is monitored in real time. So why can't we do that in the healthcare system? So our mission is we're trying to unite the UK's health data to make discoveries that improve patients' lives. All this multi-dimensional data, wearables, sensors, how do we unite it to improve patients' lives? I'll canter through this. So we're a bit different. We have 10 funders. We sit in the Wellcome Trust in London. We're very lean, and we're not a data controller. So we want to do the stuff which actually drives that interoperability to make lives easier, to drive standardization so that journeys of care can be followed to improve patients' lives. But what we've done is set up health data science systems roughly on the scale of about 5 million people, because it's more tractable, but really trying to drive the connectedness. We're pretty young, and we've got an initial investment of about £120 million. So our strategic aims are threefold: triple aim, science, training, and infrastructure, all built upon trust. And I'll touch upon each of those now. And using some of the principles I've outlined, if we get this right, we'll be able to scale. This is detail and scale, and it's about bringing these skills into our world. So we'll be able to deliver on scientific discovery, cohort announcement, prevention of disease, earlier diagnosis at scale. So after a competition, we've got 6 sites initially. We're going to fill the gaps. So we've got the Scottish lot. Ian's here from Northern Ireland working in partnership with Wales. We've got London working as a cluster, Cambridge cluster, really trying to join up the UK. It's not about erosion of competition. It's about knowing when collaboration makes sense, rather than all wrestling with the same issues. We've got great directors and associate directors across the UK who are providing national leadership. And we've also got physical instances. Because if you're going to bring ethicists together with lawyers, computer scientists, biochemists, and clinicians, they need to breathe the same air. This is a different type of science. It's team science. And you need to understand each other's worlds. So we're doing research at scale. So we don't want to do stuff that individual universities can do. So in trials, in applied health analytics, that's the efferent loop, in precision medicine, in public health, and in cancer, Mark Lawler's leading this from Belfast, we're thinking, how do we do large-scale science, large-scale science? And this is all underpinned by the Human Phenome Project, that accurate, open, accessible library of human phenotypes, which is reusable. So I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm just going to show you one example, which is the trials thing. Why are we interested in trials? Because we need a new approach to clinical trials. The clinical trial model of the 20th century is dead, actually. It's too expensive. 2 recent trials of PCSK9 inhibitors cost over $1 billion each. Who here's got $1 billion? It's just not affordable. 85% of trials fail to recruit. So there's a major issue in the trials space. And what we're seeing in pharma is actually a move away from preventative and long-term treatments for more common diseases to a focus on very expensive drugs for rare conditions. That's been market-driven because phase 3 is too expensive. So under the leadership of Martin Landry and many others, we're saying, can we make trials data-driven so that across the trial cycle, how do we use data in terms of inclusion criteria, in terms of ascertaining where the patients are? Can we access methods for large-scale invitation? And how do we really embed patients as part of the trial team? And one example of that is led by Martin with NHS Digital. We wanted to recruit 12,000 patients with prior MI, ischemic heart stroke, or peripheral vascularization. So we took the entire English data set of 55 million people, and then we did some analysis of geographical clustering of where patients are. So the size of the blob is indicative of how many patients are associated with the hospital, and that allows us actually to strategically identify recruitment sites. So it's using data to really enable the trials pathway. Second thing we're doing is talent, training. Across the patch, this isn't just health, Europe needs 346,000 more data scientists by next year. So where are they going to come from? So there's a huge, and if you want to retrain as a data scientist. Demand, you'll never be out of a job. 70% of them are unfilled. In the UK, they cluster around London, but a starting salary is about £50,000. It's a lot of money. And sadly, we struggle to retain them in health because they get snapped up by the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the banks. So this is a big thing, but we're looking at that twofold. We're looking at the training pathway so we make them feel valued in academia, because often these technologists are stuck on administrative pay scales, valued in our health systems. And secondly, we're partnering with many colleagues because we want to train up to 10,000 health data scientists by 2023, both in terms of literacy, but also in terms of future leaders, PhDs, MScs, PhDs, postdocs, future leaders. So that's a big thing. And our third thing is infrastructure. So this is the most bold and ambitious part of this, because we want to create a robust UK-wide trustworthy health data research infrastructure, which drives that interoperability that I talked about. So we've been given a modicum of resource, initially about £40 million to show confidence in this. But actually, we learned from other industries. So I talked about GSM earlier, so that's Mobile Telecommunications Standard. In this city, every year, the GSM standards folk get together, and there's about 80,000 of them. They come and agree the standards for the next generation of mobile telecommunications. In banking, SWIFT is the global provider of secure financial messaging services. So these banks are hugely competitive, as you will be with some folk down the road, but when they need to communicate, they do it well. 7.1 billion messages a year. Look at that fidelity in terms of performance. And what they're performing is a neutral global cooperative structure. So it doesn't control data SWIFT, it drives the connectedness between institutions. And that's our model. So we don't want to control data. We have patients who have interfaces with systems, whether that's cohorts, whether that's NHS systems. So we've created an alliance, a bit like SWIFT, to say how we're going to work together. We then are curating data in a very high quality way, a bit like Flatiron did, to demonstrate the utility. And then we have a gateway which actually allows researchers from anywhere in the world to discover data without any personal identifiable information actually being required. It's a bit like, Skyscanner, how you look to see what the best flight is. So it's a common gateway which allows you to discover, access, link data at scale, So that's where we are. It's early days, but the alliance is up and running. So that's that we're starting to define those governance, public interest standards. And of course, to do this requires partnership. So I think this is a key message from me. This is not about a brave new institution. It's about working really deep in partnership, whether that's with the British Heart Foundation. This is Nilesh, who's invested to create a cardiovascular phenotype for the UK. 7 million people living with cardiovascular disease, whether that's with NHS Digital, which is our major curator of healthcare data, or whether it's with the Alan Turing Institute, and we've got very, very close connections there. So I'm nearly at the end, but can I just emphasize this is just moving so fast. So just think, what is coming down the road? And some of this, and I think we're all unsettled by the rise in nationalism and populism, and this is part of the problem. But so this isn't health specific, but this is a report I would point to. Future Today Institute. These are trends. So they've been publishing annual trends for the last 12 years. And how is technology changing the world? And some of this is quite unsettling. Their conclusion, this is their conclusion, not my conclusion. Their conclusion this year, this was published a couple of weeks ago, privacy is dead. Well, there's quite a stark statement. Just by virtue of being alive in 2019, you are generating data both intentionally and unwittingly. As you know, when you drive down the motorway, you're photographed 100 times. That is mined, refined, productized, and monetized. So that's a challenging. This was an interesting one. The big 9 is important. There are 9 big tech companies, 6 American and 3 Chinese. There is not one European big tech company. I quite like the acronym G-Mafia, which is Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, IBM, and Amazon. Okay? And BAT, which is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Now, the key to this is that, we all talk about AI. It's not happening in the universities, really. 90% of spend is in the companies. 90% of the spend is in the companies. So we need a way of aligning that spend. Thirdly, China continues to ascend, and not just in artificial intelligence. We saw it on the news today, Google and Huawei. So ignore China at our peril. This is an interesting one. Voice search optimization is the new search engine optimization. That's, classically we type stuff into a keyboard. They're suggesting that about half of the interactions we will have will be by voice by the end of next year, rather than us having to type stuff in. Fifthly, personal data records are coming, a single unifying ledger that includes all of the data we create as a result of our digital use. And some countries in Europe are moving towards that. I don't know if there are any folk from Estonia here. You're to be applauded about how you've tried to adopt this in a trustworthy way. Sadly, and I feel, we've got to support the regulators. They're not prepared to deal with this. Usually regulation's 5 to 10 years behind. And what we see is increasing consolidation. And this is why some folks say we should break up Facebook, because the network effect actually means there are only 1 or 2 dominant players in the market. So this is quite a sobering slide. However, we are in Barcelona. I hope I've convinced you that this thing called data science is going to disrupt medicine in our lifetime. We've got to strive to deliver the opportunities, because it has immense opportunities, but at the same time, we have responsibilities to look at the safeguards and the trust and the public interest test, which should be at the heart of everything we do. It has opportunities for science, innovation, training, but most importantly, can we make lives better for our patients through optimal whole system intelligence for care, service planning, research, and innovation? But to do this, we'll need partnerships at the European and arguably the global level, but not just within academia. It does need NHS equivalent academic industry partnerships, but with that common theme of ensuring everything we do is in the public trust. So to finish with Bill Gates, I actually met him a few weeks ago. It was great. I went home to my wife. I said, this is a bit funny, because I'm not a computer scientist. I said, I ended up giving a lecture to Bill Gates about computer science. And she did laugh. So we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Don't let yourself be lulled into inaction. This is coming. But to do it, the new Einsteins will be the scientists who share. From cancer to cosmology, researchers could race ahead by working together online and in the open. And I'd like to leave you with that message. So thank you for your attention. This is a terrific meeting. Thank you very much.